I'm Noelle Rivera, 26. Until 3 weeks ago, I believed family meant unconditional love and a place at the table. Then I discovered I wasn't invited to Thanksgiving, not because there wasn't room, but because they didn't want me in. Family photos. I had been erased before I knew I was missing. My mother's words still echo. We just want pictures to look normal this year, mija. What she didn't know was that I'd been secretly paying for my nephew's speech therapy for 8 months, sending money I barely had. But what I found in those family photos changed everything I thought I knew about belonging. What would you do if your family photoshopped you out of existence? Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from. And if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. Let me take you back to where this all began. Not 3 weeks ago, but years earlier, in the cramped apartment I call home in Washington Heights. It's a 4th-floor walk-up with radiators that clank like old bones and windows that rattle when the subway passes underneath. But it's mine. And more importantly, it's where I keep my cameras. I have 17 of them, lined up on floating shelves, that I installed myself after watching 3 YouTube tutorials. Each camera tells a story. Not just the stories they've captured, but the stories of how they came to me. The 1970s Canon AE-1 belonged to Mrs. Chen from the corner laundromat. She gave it to me after I helped her son apply for citizenship. The weathered Nikon F3 came from a pawn shop in the Bronx, where the owner knocked $50 off the price because I listened to him talk about his grandson for 20 minutes. The sleek digital Panasonic, my workhorse, was a birthday gift to myself last year, purchased with money I probably should have spent on rent. This collection represents everything my family doesn't understand about me. To them, cameras are for family portraits and vacation snapshots. To me, they're instruments of truth, tools for capturing the stories that matter, the ones that usually go untold. My mother, Noelle Rivera, sees my apartment as evidence of my failure to thrive. When she visits, which isn't often, she surveys the vintage cameras with the same expression she reserves for spoiled milk. Mija, she'll say, touching the Canon's worn leather grip with the tips of her fingers. When are you going to get a real job? These toys won't pay for your future. What she doesn't understand is that these toys have been paying for more than she knows. For 8 months, I've been transferring $300 from my barely there savings account to help cover the cost of my nephew Miguel's speech therapy. Miguel is my sister Talia's 5-year-old son, born with a mild form of apraxia that makes it hard for him to form words clearly. The therapy isn't fully covered by insurance, and while Talia and her husband Liam do well for themselves, she's a corporate lawyer, he's an environmental consultant, the additional expense was stretching them thin. I never told anyone about the payments. It started when I overheard Talia on the phone with our mother, voice tight with stress, explaining that they might have to cut back on Miguel's sessions. I was there for Sunday dinner, hiding in the kitchen while pretending to help with dishes, when I heard her say, "Maybe we can find a cheaper therapist, but Dr. Martinez is so good with him, and Miguel finally trusts her." That night, I went home and calculated how much I could spare. $300 meant eating more rice and beans, meant saying no to coffee dates with friends, meant walking instead of taking the subway whenever possible. But it also meant Miguel could keep working with Dr. Martinez, could keep making the progress that lit up his face when he successfully pronounced a difficult word. The irony isn't lost on me that I've been sacrificing for a family that apparently doesn't want me visible in their most important moments. But that's getting ahead of myself. Let me tell you about the work that actually sustains my soul, even if it doesn't always sustain my bank account. I'm a documentary filmmaker, though. I use the term loosely since most of my projects live on YouTube and Vimeo rather than in theaters. I specialize in immigration stories, families torn apart by bureaucracy, young dreamers fighting for their right to exist, elderly immigrants trying to maintain their cultural identity while adapting to a new country. My latest project follows 3 families in different stages of the immigration process. There's the Hernandez family, who've been waiting 4 years for their asylum hearing while their teenage daughter excels in AP classes and dreams of becoming a doctor. There's elderly Mr. Patel, who came here 30 years ago but struggles with the citizenship test because English is his third language. And there's Sophia, a 19-year-old who was brought here as a child and just found out her DACA status might be revoked. I spend my days in community centers and family apartments, setting up my cameras and listening to stories that deserve to be heard. The work is emotionally exhausting and financially precarious, but it feels essential in a way that nothing else ever has. When Mr. Patel finally passes his citizenship test and breaks down crying as he tells me about calling his son in India, with the news, when Sophia gets accepted to community college despite her uncertain status, when the Hernandez family finally gets their hearing date, these moments remind me why I chose this path. My family doesn't see it that way. To them, my career choice is an extended act of rebellion, a refusal to grow up and join the respectable world they've worked so hard to access. My parents, Marco and Noelle Rivera, came to New York from Puerto Rico in 1978, when my mother was pregnant with Talia. They arrived with 2 suitcases, a fierce determination to build something better, and an unwavering belief that success meant assimilation. My father worked double shifts at the post office while my mother cleaned houses and took English classes at night. They saved every penny, bought a small house in Queens, and raised their children with the understanding that education and respectability were the only paths to security. Talia absorbed this lesson completely. She graduated summa cum laude from Fordham, went to law school on a scholarship, and now works for a firm that represents Fortune 500 companies. I was supposed to follow her lead. I was supposed to be the second success story, the proof that their sacrifices had been worth it. Instead, I dropped out of Columbia's journalism graduate program after 2 semesters, claiming it felt too theoretical, too removed from the stories I actually wanted to tell. The truth was more complicated. I was drowning in debt and panic attacks, trying to fit into a world that valued objectivity over empathy, prestige over purpose. My parents were devastated. My mother didn't speak to me for 3 weeks. My father expressed his disappointment through pointed silence and heavy sighs. Even now, 5 years later, they introduce me to their friends as our daughter who's still figuring things out, which is their polite way of saying I'm a disappointment. The worst part is that I understand their perspective. They worked so hard to give their children opportunities they never had, and here I am, squandering those opportunities to follow my passion. In their world, passion is a luxury you can afford after you've achieved security. In my world, security, without passion, feels like death by 1,000 paper cuts. This fundamental disconnect has created a chasm between us that widens with each family gathering. I show up to Sunday dinners and holiday celebrations feeling like an actor playing a role I never auditioned for. I deflect questions about my love life, because explaining that I'm dating women would add another layer of disappointment to their already heavy burden. I downplay my financial struggles because admitting I sometimes survive on credit cards would confirm their worst fears about my choices. And yet, I keep showing up, keep hoping that someday they'll see my work not as a phase to outgrow but as a calling to respect. I keep thinking that if I just prove myself enough, if I just show them that my path has value too, they'll make room for me in their vision of what the Rivera family should be. That hope is what made the Thanksgiving exclusion so devastating, because for all our differences, for all the ways I failed to meet their expectations, I never doubted that I belonged to them. I never questioned that when it came to family, real family, blood family. I would always have a place. The apartment where I'm telling you this story sits directly above a Dominican restaurant that starts cooking at 5 a.m. The smell of sofrito and garlic wafts up through the floorboards, mixing with the scent of the candles I light when I'm editing late into the night. It's a small space, barely 600 square feet, but it's arranged with the precision of someone who's learned to make every inch count. My editing station occupies one corner of the living room, a desk I assembled from IKEA parts, 2 monitors I bought refurbished, and a chair that's seen better days, but still supports my back during long editing sessions. This is where I spend most of my time, piecing together the fragments of people's lives into coherent narratives, trying to find the universal truths within individual struggles. The work is solitary by necessity, but I've never felt lonely here. There's something about this process, the careful selection of moments, the deliberate pacing of revelation, the way music and silence can transform raw footage into something that moves people, that feels like the closest thing to prayer I've ever experienced. It's also where I was sitting 3 weeks ago when everything changed. I was working on a rough cut of Sophia's story, trying to find the right balance between her vulnerability and her strength, when my phone buzzed with a text message that would redefine my understanding of family forever. But I'm getting ahead of myself again. First, you need to understand just how normal that November morning felt. How ordinary the day seemed before it became the day that split my life into before and after. You need to understand that I was happy. Not perfectly, not completely, but genuinely content with the life I'd built for myself. I was finally starting to see a path forward, finally beginning to believe that I could sustain myself doing work that mattered. That morning, I made coffee in the small French press that was a housewarming gift from my friend Jasmine, and I sat at my desk reviewing footage from the previous day's interview with Mr. Patel. He had been telling me about his first job in America, working in a factory where no one spoke Hindi, and he spent his breaks drawing pictures to communicate with his coworkers. The story was heartbreaking and beautiful, and I was excited about how it would fit into the larger narrative of his journey. I had no idea that in a few hours, I would be questioning my own place in the family story I thought I knew by heart. The thing about belonging is that you don't appreciate it until it's threatened. Growing up, I took for granted that I was woven into the fabric of the Rivera family narrative. Yes, I was different. The artsy one, the rebel, the one who asked too many questions during Sunday Mass. But different didn't mean disposable. Or, so I thought. My earliest memory of feeling truly seen by my family was at my grandmother Lourdes' house when I was 7. She had given me her old Polaroid camera, and I spent the afternoon taking pictures of everything. The way afternoon light streamed through her lace curtains, my grandfather's weathered hands as he read his newspaper, the Virgin Mary statue that watched over us from the mantelpiece. When I showed the pictures to everyone at dinner, instead of the usual patronizing smiles adults give children's efforts, I saw something different in my grandmother's eyes. Recognition. Understanding. You. See things others miss, Mija, she told me later, helping me arrange the Polaroids in a small photo album. That's a gift. Don't let anyone convince you it's not valuable. Grandma Lourdes died 5 years ago, taking with her the last person in my family who truly understood my vision. Her death marked the beginning of my slow drift away from the family center, though I didn't recognize it at the time. Without her gentle advocacy, my parents' concerns about my unconventional path grew louder. My sister's success cast a sharper contrast against my struggling freelance career. The morning that changed everything started like most others in my small apartment. I woke to the familiar sounds of the city awakening. Garbage trucks rumbling down the street, the Dominican restaurant below firing up their grills, my upstairs neighbor's toddler running back and forth across creaking floorboards. These sounds had become my urban lullaby, the soundtrack to a life I'd chosen despite its challenges. I remember thinking, as I stood at my kitchen window sipping coffee and watching delivery trucks navigate the narrow streets, that I was finally finding my rhythm. My latest documentary project was gaining traction. A local community center had offered to screen it, and I'd received inquiries from 2 other filmmakers interested in collaboration. For the first time in months, I felt like I was moving in the right direction, rather than just treading water. The text message arrived at 11:47 a.m. on a Tuesday, while I was reviewing footage of Sophia explaining why she chose to major in social work despite her uncertain immigration status. The irony of the timing wasn't lost on me later. There I was, documenting someone else's struggle for belonging while my own was about to be shattered. My phone buzzed against the desk, and I glanced at it absent-mindedly, expecting a message from one of my documentary subjects. Or maybe Jasmine asking about lunch plans. Instead, I saw a notification that made my stomach drop. I had been added to a group text called Rivera Family Thanksgiving Planning. At first, I felt a flutter of inclusion. Maybe this year would be different. Maybe they were finally ready to treat me like a full member of the family, to involve me in the planning, instead of just expecting me to show up and smile politely while they discussed my life choices over turkey and judgment. I clicked on the message thread, expecting to see logistical details about timing and who was bringing what dish. What I found instead was a conversation that had apparently been going on for hours without me, a conversation that redefined everything I thought I knew about my place in this family. The messages started innocuously enough. Talia had written, "Mom, did you confirm the time with the photographer? I want to make sure we have enough light for the family portraits." My mother's response, "Yes, mija. He'll be there at 2 p.m. right after we eat." I told him we want the traditional shots. The whole family by the fireplace, the grandparents with Miguel, and some candid ones during dinner. Then came the message that stopped my heart. "Perfect. And you talked to him about the other thing we discussed?" My mother, "Yes, he understands. The photos will look exactly how we want them to look, clean and professional." Talia, "Good. I know it sounds harsh, but these are the pictures we'll have forever. They need to represent the family the right way." I sat there staring at my phone, reading and rereading these messages, trying to understand what I was seeing. What was the other thing? Why did they need the photos to look clean? And why was I being added to this conversation now, after they'd clearly been planning for hours? The next message from my father clarified everything. "I still don't feel right about this. Noelle is family." My mother's response came quickly. "Marco, we've talked about this. This is about the family image. These photos will be on our walls, in our Christmas cards. People will see them. Noelle can come to dinner. Of course she can come to dinner, but the formal portraits need to show the family as it should be." Talia chimed in. "Dad, you know I love Noelle, but Mom's right. These are professional portraits. They're going to be displayed in our homes and offices. We need them to represent stability and success. Noelle's phase doesn't fit that image. Phase. My career, my identity, my entire life's work reduced to a phase. I felt like I was watching a car accident in slow motion, unable to look away from the screen as my family dissected my worth in casual text messages. But the worst was yet to come. My mother. "I already talked to the photographer. He knows to work around her presence. We'll do the family photos first before she arrives. That way everyone can relax and be natural." The implication hit me like a physical blow. They weren't just planning to exclude me from some photos, they were planning the entire day around my absence. They had orchestrated Thanksgiving so that the real family could have their moment without me tainting it with my existence. But even that wasn't the final knife twist. That came from Liam, my brother-in-law, who had always been kind to me, who had always seemed to appreciate my unconventional perspective. "Liam, I understand the reasoning, but shouldn't we at least tell her directly? It feels dishonest to let her think she's invited to everything when she's not." My mother. "She is invited to everything that matters. Dinner, time with the family, time with Miguel. Just not the formal portraits. There's no need to make it into a big drama. She'll understand." Talia. "Exactly. And honestly, she probably won't even want to be in professional photos anyway. You know how she feels about formal events. The casualness of their assumption, that I wouldn't want to be included, that I would somehow naturally understand my exclusion, was perhaps the most devastating part of all. They had convinced themselves that erasing me was actually a kindness. I sat in my apartment, surrounded by the cameras that represented my life's work, reading these messages over and over until the words blurred together. The Sophia documentary played on my monitor, her voice talking about the pain of not knowing where you belong, while I discovered that I didn't belong anywhere at all. The group text continued, with logistics about timing and food assignments, as if they hadn't just casually planned my erasure from family history. My cousin Maria would bring the flan. My uncle Roberto would handle the music. The photographer would arrive early to capture the real family before I could contaminate the frame with my presence. I took a screenshot of the entire conversation. I'm not sure why. Maybe I needed proof that this had actually happened, that my family had actually discussed excluding me with the same energy they used to debate whether to serve rice or potatoes. Maybe I knew even then that this screenshot would become evidence in a story I didn't yet know I was going to tell. The most surreal part was that none of them seemed to realize I could see these messages. They had added me to the group text, presumably to inform me about dinner timing, but had somehow forgotten that I could scroll up and read their entire conversation. It was as if I was invisible even in their attempts to include me. I tried to rationalize their words, to find some interpretation that wouldn't shatter my understanding of family love. Maybe they were just worried about appearances because of my father's work connections. Maybe they thought I would be more comfortable not being in formal photos because of my anxiety about cameras being turned on me instead of me being behind them. Maybe this was all a misunderstanding that would resolve itself if I just talked to them directly. But even as I tried to convince myself of these alternative explanations, I knew the truth. This wasn't about logistics or comfort levels. This was about shame. My family was ashamed of me, of my purple hair, of my unconventional career, of my refusal to fit into their vision of respectability. They were ashamed enough to actively plan around my exclusion, to choreograph Thanksgiving so that their real family could be documented without me. I thought about the $300 I had been secretly sending to help with Miguel's therapy. I thought about all the family events I had attended despite feeling like an outsider, all the times I had bitten my tongue when my parents introduced me as their daughter, who was still figuring things out. I thought about how hard I had worked to maintain a relationship with people who apparently saw me as a problem to be managed, rather than a person to be loved. The Dominican restaurant below me was starting their lunch prep, and the smell of garlic and onions wafted up through the floorboards. It was a scent that usually comforted me, but today it just reminded me of how alone I was in this moment. I was surrounded by the evidence of my life's work, but apparently that work, my passion, my purpose, my contribution to the world, meant nothing to the people who were supposed to love me unconditionally. I started typing a response to the group text several times, but each attempt felt either too angry or too pathetic. What could I say? I can see all your messages and I'm hurt that you're planning to exclude me. I've been secretly helping pay for Miguel's therapy while you debate whether I'm worthy of being in your family photos. I thought family was supposed to love you, even when you don't fit their image of perfection. Instead, I set my phone aside and tried to focus on Sophia's story, but the words she was saying seemed to echo my own situation. The hardest part isn't not knowing where you belong. It's discovering that you don't belong where you thought you did. I rewound the footage and played it again and again until her words lost all meaning and became just sounds in the background of my crumbling understanding of family. The group text continued to buzz with messages throughout the day. Someone suggested making 2 kinds of stuffing. Someone else worried about having enough chairs. My mother reminded everyone to dress nicely for the photos. Normal family planning, as if they hadn't just casually decided that one family member wasn't worthy of being permanently documented alongside the rest. By evening, I had made a decision. I wasn't going to confront them directly about the text messages. I wasn't going to create the big drama my mother was so worried about. Instead, I was going to show up to Thanksgiving dinner as planned, smile politely, and pretend I didn't know that they had orchestrated the entire day around my exclusion. But I was also going to start documenting this experience, the way I documented the stories of my subjects. I was going to treat my own erasure as a story worth telling, a narrative that deserved to be preserved and understood. Because if my family was going to exclude me from their visual history, maybe it was time for me to create my own. I opened a new project file on my computer and titled it Invisible. Then I imported the screenshot of the group text messages, the first piece of evidence in what would become the most important documentary I would ever make. The thing about being erased is that it only works if you let it. If you accept that, you're not worthy of being seen, of being remembered, of taking up space in the frame. But I had spent years behind cameras, learning how to capture the stories of people who had been overlooked and undervalued. I knew how to make the invisible visible. I just never thought I would have to do it for myself. That night, I couldn't sleep. I lay in bed staring at the ceiling, listening to the familiar sounds of the city that usually lulled me to sleep. Distant sirens, the occasional horn, the rumble of late-night delivery trucks. But tonight, these sounds felt different. They felt like the soundtrack to my displacement, the urban symphony of not belonging anywhere. I kept picking up my phone and rereading the group text messages, each time hoping I had misunderstood something, that there was some context I had missed that would make this all make sense. But the words remained the same. Cold, calculated, dismissive. Around 3 a.m, I got up and made tea, sitting at my small kitchen table surrounded by the ambient light of the city filtering through my windows. I thought about calling Jasmine. But what would I say? How do you explain to someone that your family has decided you're not worth including in their permanent memories? I found myself thinking about my grandmother Lourdes, about what she would have said if she knew about this. She had always been my defender, the one who saw value in my differences rather than reasons for shame. When I was 12 and wanted to dye my hair blue, she was the one who convinced my mother to let me do it. "Let her express herself, Inez," I remembered her saying. "Her spirit is too bright to dim with our fears." But Grandma Lourdes was gone, and with her had gone my protection from my family's judgment. Without her gentle advocacy, I had slowly become the problem child, the one whose presence required management rather than celebration. I thought about Miguel, too, and how the money I had been secretly sending for his therapy would continue to flow even as his family planned to erase me from their official history. There was something darkly poetic about that, continuing to support a family that didn't want to acknowledge my existence. The screenshot of the group text sat in my computer, waiting to become part of something larger. I stared at it for a long time, this digital evidence of my family's casual cruelty, and felt something shift inside me. This wasn't just about Thanksgiving anymore. This was about reclaiming my narrative, about refusing to be disappeared even when the people who should love me most wanted me to fade away. By dawn, I had made my decision. I would go to Thanksgiving dinner as planned, but I wouldn't go as the grateful family member pretending not to notice her exclusion. I would go as a documentarian, observing and recording the dynamics that had shaped my entire life. I would document my own erasure, and in doing so, make it impossible to ignore. The recipe box sat on top of my refrigerator, collecting dust like so many other remnants of my grandmother's life that I couldn't bear to use, but couldn't bring myself to put away. It was a simple wooden box, painted yellow with hand-drawn flowers along the edges, the kind of craft project that screamed 1970s church auxiliary. Grandma Lourdes had given it to me the Christmas before she died, along with all her handwritten recipes and a gentle suggestion that I learn to cook something besides ramen and takeout. "Mija," she had said, pressing the box into my hands with the solemnity of passing down crown jewels. A woman who can't feed herself properly can't feed her soul properly either. These recipes aren't just food. They're love made tangible. For 5 years, that box had remained unopened on my refrigerator, a shrine to good intentions and guilt. I told myself I was too busy, too broke to buy ingredients for elaborate Puerto Rican dishes, too intimidated by the prospect of failing to recreate my grandmother's magic. But the truth was simpler and more painful. Cooking her recipes would have meant accepting that she was really gone. The morning after my sleepless night processing the group text messages, I found myself standing in my kitchen, staring up at that yellow box, as if it held answers to questions I was only beginning to formulate. Something about discovering my family's betrayal had shifted my relationship to my grandmother's memory. If my living family could casually exclude me from their tradition of togetherness, maybe it was time to reconnect with the family member who had never questioned my right to belong. I dragged a chair over to the refrigerator and carefully lifted down the recipe box. It was heavier than I remembered, weighted with the substance of a life lived in service to others. The wooden lid creaked as I opened it, releasing the faint scent of vanilla and cinnamon that seemed to emanate from the handwritten index cards within. My grandmother's handwriting was distinctive, careful, old-fashioned cursive learned in a time when penmanship mattered. Each recipe card was a small work of art, not just for the elegant script, but for the personal annotations that surrounded the formal ingredients and instructions. Add extra sofrito if Marco is coming. He likes more flavor. Reduce sugar for Inez. She worries about her figure. Make double batch when Noelle visits. She always wants leftovers. That last note, written in fading blue ink on the recipe for her famous tres leches cake, nearly broke me. Even in death, my grandmother was making space for me at the table, planning for my appetite, anticipating my needs. She had seen me as someone worth cooking extra for, worth accommodating, worth including in her calculations of love. I pulled out the card for pastels, her specialty that took 2 days to prepare and required the whole family working together. Grating plantains, seasoning pork, spreading mesa, wrapping everything in plantain leaves like presents that would be revealed in the steam of Christmas morning. The card was stained with years of use, evidence of all the times my grandmother had orchestrated this elaborate dance of tradition. But there was another note on this card, one that stopped me cold. Noelle has good hands for this work. Patient. Gentle. She understands that some things take time to come together right. I had forgotten about the pastels lessons. I was 15, sulky and resistant to spending my Christmas vacation engaged in what seemed like unnecessary labor when we could just buy the pastels from the grocery store. But my grandmother had insisted, and somehow she had made me understand that this wasn't about efficiency. It was about continuity, about carrying forward the knowledge that connected us to all the women who had stood in kitchens before us, transforming simple ingredients into expressions of love. You have to feel the masa, mija, she had taught me, guiding my hands as I spread the plantain mixture across the banana leaf. Too thick, and it won't cook through. Too thin, and it won't hold the filling. It's like life. You have to find the right balance between substance and delicacy. Telling and preparing this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. Now, sitting in my apartment with that recipe card in my hands, I understood that she had been teaching me more than cooking technique. She had been showing me how to nurture, how to create something meaningful from raw materials, how to feed people in ways that went beyond mere sustenance. I decided to call Jasmine. If I was going to attempt to cook one of my grandmother's recipes, I needed moral support and someone to eat the results if I succeeded, or order pizza if I failed spectacularly. "Girl, it's 8 a.m, Jasmine answered on the third ring, her voice thick with sleep. "This better be an emergency, or you better be offering me breakfast." "Both, actually," I said, surprised by the shakiness in my own voice. "I need to tell you something, and I need help making pernil." There was a pause, during which I could practically hear Jasmine sitting up in bed, shifting from sleepy annoyance to full attention. She knew me well enough to recognize that a spontaneous decision to cook Puerto Rican pork shoulder at 8 a.m. was not normal behavior. "Okay, I'm listening. Start with the emergency part." I told her about the group text, about discovering that my family had planned Thanksgiving around my exclusion, about the casual way they had discussed my worthiness to be permanently documented alongside them. As the words poured out, I felt some of the pressure in my chest release, as if speaking the betrayal aloud made it smaller, more manageable. Jasmine listened without interrupting, occasionally making small sounds of sympathy or outrage. When I finished, she was quiet for a long moment before speaking. "Noelle," she said finally, "that's incredibly fucked up. I'm so sorry. But also, and I hope you don't take this the wrong way, I'm kind of proud of you." Proud of me for what? For being the family disappointment? No, proud of you for finally seeing them clearly. Do you know how many times I've watched you twist yourself into knots trying to earn approval from people who were never going to give it? How many times you've made excuses for their behavior, convinced yourself that if you just tried harder, they'd finally accept you? She was right, of course. I had spent years in the exhausting dance of seeking validation from people who had already decided I wasn't worth validating. I had blamed myself for the distance in our relationships, assumed that if I could just be more conventional, more successful, more like Talia, they would embrace me fully. "So what's this about pernil?" Jasmine continued, her voice gentling. "And why are you trying to cook when you're in crisis? That seems like a recipe for disaster, no pun intended." I explained about the recipe box, about my grandmother's notes, about feeling like I needed to connect with the part of my family that had never questioned my value. I know it sounds ridiculous, but I feel like cooking her food might help me remember who I am when I'm not trying to be who they want me to. That doesn't sound ridiculous at all," Jasmine said. "It sounds like exactly what you need. Give me an hour to get dressed and caffeinated, and I'll come over. We're going to cook your grandmother's pernil, and you're going to tell me more about this documentary project you mentioned." After we hung up, I spread several recipe cards across my small kitchen table, studying my grandmother's handwriting as if it were a treasure map leading back to myself. Each card told the story of a woman who had understood that food was love, that feeding people was an act of radical generosity, that recipes were really instructions for creating connection. I thought about the contrast between these cards, covered in love notes and accommodation for individual preferences, and the cold efficiency of my family's text messages. My grandmother had planned meals around inclusion, had made extra when she knew I was coming, had noted which flavors would please which family members. My living family had planned an entire holiday around my exclusion, had choreographed Thanksgiving, so that my presence wouldn't contaminate their picture-perfect narrative. When Jasmine arrived an hour later with coffee and bagels, she found me, sitting at the table surrounded by recipe cards, my laptop open to a new document titled Invisible, a Documentary Treatment. "Look at you, already channeling pain into art," she said, settling into the chair across from me. "Tell me about this project." I explained my idea to document my own erasure, to turn the camera on my family's dynamics the way I had turned it on the immigration stories that had shaped my career. I want to explore what it means to be disappeared by the people who are supposed to love you unconditionally. I want to understand how families decide who gets to be visible and who gets erased. Jasmine nodded thoughtfully, sipping her coffee as she listened. "That's powerful, and personal documentaries can be incredibly impactful when they're done right. But are you sure you're ready for the emotional toll? This isn't like interviewing other people about their trauma. This is your trauma, and putting it on camera might make it more painful before it makes it better." She was right to be concerned. I had spent years behind the camera precisely because it felt safer than being in front of it. The idea of turning that lens on my own life, of making myself the subject instead of the observer, was terrifying. But it also felt necessary, like the only way to reclaim agency in a situation where I had been rendered powerless. "I know it won't be easy," I said. "But I keep thinking about something my grandmother used to say about cooking. She said that the best dishes come from taking raw ingredients, things that might be bitter or tough on their own, and transforming them through time and attention into something nourishing." Jasmine smiled. "Your grandmother sounds like she was wise. So we're going to cook her pernil and brainstorm your documentary?" "Exactly. Because I think both projects are about the same thing, taking something that might seem damaged or unwanted and finding a way to make it valuable. We spent the next hour planning both the meal and the documentary. Jasmine helped me think through the technical aspects of filming myself, the ethical considerations of including family members who hadn't consented to be documented, and the narrative structure that would make my personal story resonate with a broader audience. The key, she said, making notes on a napkin as we talked, is to make sure this isn't just about your family being shitty. It needs to be about something universal, about belonging, about chosen family versus blood family, about the ways people get marginalized even in supposedly loving relationships. As we talked, I found myself thinking about the immigrant families I had documented, about the ways their stories of displacement and belonging echoed my own experience. Sophia, struggling to find her place in a country that questioned her right to exist. Mr. Patel, navigating the tension between preserving his identity and assimilating into American culture. The Hernandez family, waiting years for official recognition of their worth, their right to stay, their value to the community. We were all fighting the same battle, in different ways. The battle to be seen, to be valued, to take up space in narratives that would prefer we remain invisible. By the time we started preparing the pernil, I had the outline of a documentary that felt both deeply personal and universally relevant. The recipe box sat open on the counter, my grandmother's. Instructions guiding us through the process of creating something beautiful from simple ingredients. "You know what I love about this?" Jasmine said, rubbing the garlic and oregano marinade into the pork shoulder. "Your grandmother's recipes aren't just about food. They're about abundance, about making sure everyone has enough, about planning for love." She was right. Every recipe in that box reflected my grandmother's expansive understanding of family, her belief that there was always room for one more person at the table, her conviction that love could be measured in extra portions and personalized accommodations. As the pernil began its slow roast in my oven, filling my apartment with the familiar sense of my childhood, I felt something shift inside me. This wasn't just about cooking my grandmother's food or planning a documentary about my family's rejection. This was about choosing which version of family I wanted to emulate going forward. The week after my pernil making session with Jasmine, I threw myself into finishing the immigration documentary with an intensity that bordered on obsession. Something about my own experience of displacement had sharpened my understanding of my subject's stories, made me see patterns and connections that had been invisible before. Every interview, every piece of footage, every moment of struggle captured on camera seemed to reflect back my own journey toward understanding what it meant to belong. I was in the community center on Thursday afternoon, reviewing footage of Sophia's citizenship interview preparation, when she said something that stopped me cold. The camera was rolling as she practiced answering questions about American history and government. But between the formal queries, she had started talking about her family. "The hardest part isn't the test," she said, looking directly into my camera with the kind of raw honesty that made for the best documentary moments. "It's knowing that even if I pass, even if I get my citizenship, there will always be people who see me as less American than someone who was just born here. Like I have to keep proving my right to exist in this space." I had filmed that interview 2 weeks earlier, before the group text revelation. And at the time I had focused on the civic aspects of her struggle. The bureaucratic hurdles, the language, barriers, the complex legal requirements for naturalization. But watching it again through the lens of my own exclusion, I heard something deeper in her words. Sophia wasn't just talking about legal citizenship. She was talking about the exhausting work of trying to prove your worth to people who had already decided you didn't belong. I paused the footage and sat back in my chair, staring at Sophia's face frozen on my monitor. The parallels between her experience and mine were impossible to ignore. She was fighting for recognition from a country that questioned her right to exist within its borders. I was fighting for recognition from a family that questioned my right to exist within their narrative. Both of us were trapped in the endless cycle of proving our value to institutions, national and familial, that benefited from keeping us in a state of perpetual audition. The community center was nearly empty at this hour, Just me and Mrs. Rodriguez, the coordinator who had given me permission to use their space for editing. She was organizing paperwork at the front desk. Occasionally glancing over at me with the maternal concern, she showed all the filmmakers and activists who cycled through her building. "Mija, you've been here every day this week," she said, approaching my editing station with a cup of coffee that smelled like it had been sitting on the burner since morning. "You okay? You look like you're carrying the weight of the world, Mrs." Rodriguez had emigrated from El Salvador 30 years earlier and had dedicated her life to helping other immigrants navigate the complex systems of belonging in America. She had an uncanny ability to recognize when someone was struggling with questions of identity and place. "I'm fine," I lied, then immediately corrected myself. "Actually, no, I'm not fine, but I'm working through it." She sat down in the plastic chair next to me, her presence offering the kind of comfort that came from someone who had weathered her own storms of displacement. "Tell me what's troubling you." I found myself explaining the Thanksgiving situation, the group text messages, the way my family had casually planned around my exclusion. As I spoke, I watched Mrs. Rodriguez's expression shift from curiosity to recognition to a kind of sad understanding. "Ah, mija," she said when I finished. "Family exile. I know this pain." "Family exile?" "It's what I call it when your own people decide you don't fit their version of who you should be. It's different from being rejected by strangers. That's expected. That's the price of being different. But when your family exiles you, when they decide you're too much trouble to love fully," she shook her head, "that's a special kind of heartbreak." Her words gave a name to something I had been feeling but couldn't articulate. Exile. Not abandonment, not rejection, but exile. The deliberate removal from a community you had assumed would always claim you. "Does it get easier?" I asked. Mrs. Rodriguez considered this for a moment, sipping her bitter coffee. "It gets different. You stop expecting them to change, and you start building your own community. But the scar remains, you know? The place where you used to believe you belonged, unconditionally." I thought about this as I returned to editing, Mrs. Rodriguez's words echoing in my mind as I reviewed more footage from my immigration project. The Hernandez family, still waiting for their asylum hearing after 4 years. Mr. Patel, studying for his citizenship test while working double shifts to support his family. Sophia, navigating the gap between her American dreams and her uncertain legal status, all of them living in a state of suspended belonging, waiting for someone else to decide their worth. The footage I was reviewing showed Mr. Patel in his small apartment, surrounded by citizenship study materials and family photos. He was talking about the loneliness of not quite belonging anywhere, not fully American yet, but no longer fully Indian either. "My son in Mumbai, he says I've become too American," Mr. Patel said to my camera, his accent thick with emotion. "My neighbors here, they see me as forever foreign. I exist in this space between worlds, trying to prove myself to both sides." I realized I had been holding my breath while watching this, recognizing my own predicament in his words. I wasn't caught between countries, but I was caught between versions of myself. The version my family wanted me to be, and the version I actually was. The exhaustion of trying to translate myself for people who had already decided I was speaking the wrong language. My phone buzzed with a text from Talia. "Hey, can you bring dessert for Thanksgiving? Mom's making everything else, but said you could handle dessert." The casualness of the message was jarring, as if we hadn't had that devastating group text conversation, as if they hadn't spent hours discussing my exclusion from the family photos. Now they wanted me to contribute dessert to the meal I would attend, but not be fully present for. I stared at the message for a long time before responding. "Sure, I'll bring tres leches cake." It felt important to choose my grandmother's recipe, to bring something that represented the version of family love I remembered, the kind that made space for everyone. If I was going to attend this performance of family unity while being systematically excluded from its permanent record, I was going to bring a dish that embodied actual inclusion. But as I typed the response, I felt the weight of my own complicity in this charade. By agreeing to bring dessert, by showing up to smile and pretend everything was normal, wasn't I enabling their ability to erase me while maintaining the fiction that I was included? I called Jasmine that evening, needing to process these conflicting feelings with someone who understood the complexity of family loyalty and self-preservation. I keep going back and forth, I told her as we walked through Riverside Park, the Hudson River dark and calm beside us. Part of me wants to skip Thanksgiving entirely, to refuse to participate in their performance. But part of me feels like that would just prove their point, that I'm dramatic, that I make everything about me, that I can't just go along with family traditions. What do you want to do? Jasmine asked. Not what you think you should do, not what would cause the least drama, but what do you actually want? It was a harder question than it seemed. What did I want? To be included in the family photos? To have them acknowledge the hurt they had caused? To travel back in time and have a family that had never questioned my worth in the first place? I want to understand why it's so easy for them to erase me, I said finally. I want to understand how people who claim to love you can be so casual about excluding you from their most important moments. That sounds like a documentary question, Jasmine observed. She was right. The questions that were plaguing me about my family were the same questions that drove my work with immigrant families, the same themes that had shaped my understanding of belonging and displacement. Maybe the answer wasn't to abandon the Thanksgiving dinner or to confront my family directly. Maybe the answer was to document it, to treat this experience as the story it was, a story about power, about who gets to decide who belongs, about the ways institutions preserve themselves by excluding those who don't fit their image. I think I need to film Thanksgiving, I said, the idea crystallizing as I spoke. Not secretly, not to expose them, but openly. I want to document this dynamic to show what family exile looks like from the inside. Jasmine stopped walking and turned to face me. Are you sure? That's going to be incredibly difficult emotionally. And your family is not going to be happy about being filmed. No, they won't be. But maybe that's the point. Maybe the discomfort of being observed will force them to confront what they're doing. Or maybe it won't, but at least I'll have documented it, created a record of this experience. We spent the rest of our walk planning the logistics. I would bring my smallest, most unobtrusive camera. I would be transparent about my intentions. This wasn't going to be a hidden camera expose, but an open exploration of family dynamics. I would focus on my own experience rather than trying to make them look bad. The goal isn't to punish them, I explained as we headed back toward my apartment. It's to understand this pattern, to document what it feels like to be systematically excluded from a narrative you're supposed to be part of. Back home, I returned to the immigration footage with fresh eyes. I was looking for moments that captured the emotional reality of displacement, the subtle ways people were made to feel unwelcome even in spaces they had every right to occupy. I found it in a piece of footage I had almost deleted. Sophia at a community meeting, raising her hand to ask a question about local voting procedures. The moderator had looked right past her, called on someone else, and Sophia had slowly lowered her hand, her face showing just a flicker of hurt before she composed herself again. That moment, barely 5 seconds long, captured everything I was trying to understand about systematic exclusion. It wasn't violent or dramatic. It was casual, almost unconscious. Someone in power simply decided that Sophia's voice wasn't worth hearing, and she was disappeared from the conversation without anyone even acknowledging what had happened. I created a new folder on my computer titled Thanksgiving Documentation and began outlining my approach. This wouldn't be an ambush or a gotcha moment. This would be anthropological, observational, a careful study of how families maintain their cohesion by defining who doesn't belong. As I worked late into the night, editing immigration footage and planning my Thanksgiving documentation, I felt something I hadn't experienced since the group text revelation. A sense of purpose. I was no longer just the victim of my family's casual cruelty. I was the documentarian of my own story, the person who would ensure that my experience was recorded and understood, even if I was excluded from their official version of events. The 3 leches cake recipe sat on my counter, my grandmother's. Careful handwriting promising that this dish would serve 12 people generously, but I realized I wasn't making it for them anymore. I was making it for me, for the version of family love I wanted to honor, for the understanding that true inclusion meant making sure everyone had enough. The package arrived on Monday morning, 3 days before Thanksgiving, with no return address, and my name written in block letters across the brown paper wrapping. I almost ignored it, assuming it was another piece of equipment I'd ordered and forgotten about. But something about the careful way my address was printed made me pause. Inside was a manila envelope, and inside that was something that made my hands shake. A complete set of professional family portraits from Thanksgiving 2023. The photos I had never seen, from the dinner I had attended but been excluded from documenting. There was a note, written in careful script on expensive stationery. "Noelle, I thought you should see these. Maybe it will help you understand. L.L. Liam." My brother-in-law had sent me the family portraits from last year's Thanksgiving, the ones I had been excluded from but had never thought to ask about. I had been so focused on this year's planned exclusion that I hadn't even considered that the pattern might already be established. With trembling fingers, I spread the photographs across my kitchen table. There were dozens of them, formal portraits by the fireplace, candid shots during dinner, multi-generational photos with my parents and grandparents, pictures of Miguel playing with his cousins, a complete visual record of my family's Thanksgiving celebration. And I was in exactly none of them. Not one single photograph included me, despite the fact that I had been there. I remembered that day clearly, arriving late because of a work emergency, staying for dinner, helping with cleanup, playing with Miguel in the backyard while the adults talked politics. I had been present for the entire celebration, but looking at these photos, you would never know I existed. But that wasn't the devastating part. The devastating part was how natural the photos looked without me. How complete the family appeared. How perfectly composed each shot was. How no one seemed to be looking around, wondering where I was, or suggesting we should wait for me to join the group. The photos told the story of a family that had never included me, that had never even noticed my absence. I picked up one of the formal portraits. My parents, Talia and Liam, Miguel, my grandparents, all arranged beautifully in front of the fireplace. Everyone was smiling, relaxed, genuinely happy. This wasn't the strained smile of people pretending everything was fine. This was the comfortable happiness of people who felt complete, who weren't missing anyone important. How many times had this happened? How many family gatherings had been documented without me while I was literally in the next room? How long had I been invisible to my own family? I was so absorbed in studying the photographs that I almost missed the sound of footsteps on my stairs. A knock at my door made me jump, and I quickly gathered the photos into a pile, though I wasn't sure why I felt the need to hide them. "Noelle?" "It's me," Talia's voice called through the door. I hesitated, my hand on the doorknob. What was she doing here? We hadn't spoken since the group text exchange, and she had never come to my apartment uninvited before. I opened the door to find my sister standing in the hallway, looking uncharacteristically uncertain. She was dressed in her usual work attire, expensive suit, perfect makeup, hair that had probably been styled that morning. But there was something different about her expression, a vulnerability I hadn't seen since we were children. "Can I come in?" she asked. I stepped aside, and she entered my small apartment, her eyes taking in the familiar chaos of my editing setup, the cameras on their shelves, the immigration footage still paused on my monitor. "Coffee?" I offered, though I wasn't sure why I was being hospitable to someone who had just helped orchestrate my exclusion. "Actually, yes. Thank you." I busied myself with making coffee, grateful for something to do with my hands while I tried to figure out why she was here. The family portraits were still scattered across my kitchen table, visible from where she stood, but she didn't comment on them. "Liam told me he sent you the photos," she said finally, settling into one of my mismatched chairs. I turned to face her, coffee forgotten. "So you knew he was going to do that?" "I found out this morning. We had a fight about it, actually. He said I needed to talk to you directly instead of pretending everything was fine." I poured coffee into 2 mugs, buying time to process this information. Liam had sent me the photos to force a confrontation between Talia and me. He had been the one to suggest in the group text that they should tell me directly about my exclusion from this year's portraits. Apparently, he had been more bothered by the family's deception than I had realized. "So talk," I said, sitting across from her at the table where the evidence of my erasure lay between us. Talia picked up one of the photos, the formal family portrait, and studied it with an expression I couldn't read. "Do you know what I see when I look at this picture? A family that doesn't include me?" She shook her head. "I see everything I've worked for. I see stability, success, respectability. I see proof that our parents' sacrifices paid off, that we became the kind of family they dreamed of when they came here with nothing." I felt anger flaring in my chest. "And I threaten that somehow?" "Yes," she said quietly. "You do." The honesty of her answer was like a slap. I had expected denials, excuses, attempts to minimize what they had done. I hadn't expected her to admit so directly that they saw me as a threat to their carefully constructed image. "How?" I asked, my voice barely above a whisper. "How do I threaten your success by existing?" Talia set down the photo and looked at me with an expression that was both sad and frustrated. "Because you remind everyone that there are other ways to live. Because you chose passion over security, authenticity over respectability. Because you make it obvious that I chose fear over freedom." I stared at her, trying to process what she was saying. "So you exclude me from family photos because I make you feel bad about your own choices? Because you make it impossible to pretend that the path we chose was the only valid one? Because when you're in the picture, people might ask questions about why we're all so committed to looking the same, to fitting the same mold? Because your presence makes it obvious that we could have chosen differently." The kitchen was silent, except for the hum of my refrigerator and the distant sounds of traffic below. I felt like I was seeing my family's dynamics with new clarity, understanding for the first time that my exclusion wasn't about my failures, but about their fears. "You're afraid of me," I said finally. "I'm afraid of what you represent," Talia corrected. "I'm afraid that if people see us together, they'll realize that I'm not happy, that I chose security over satisfaction, that I built a life that looks perfect from the outside but feels empty on the inside." She reached across the table and picked up another photo, one of her and Liam with Miguel, all of them laughing at something outside the frame. "I love my family. I love my life. But sometimes, when I'm around you, I remember the version of myself that wanted to be a teacher, that dreamed of traveling the world, that thought love was more important than financial stability." I felt a strange mix of compassion and anger. I understood what she was saying, but I couldn't forgive the way she had chosen to handle her own insecurities. "So, instead of dealing with your own regrets, you decided to erase me from the family narrative?" "I didn't decide anything," she said, her voice taking on the defensive tone I remembered from our childhood arguments. "This was Mom's idea. She's the one who talked to the photographer, who arranged the timing so you'd arrive after the formal portraits were done. But you went along with it. You supported it. You talked about how the photos needed to represent the family the right way." Talia flinched, clearly remembering her words from the group text. "I was protecting my family. I was protecting the image we've worked so hard to build." "I am your family," I said, my voice rising despite my efforts to stay calm. I'm your sister. I've been secretly paying for Miguel's speech therapy for months because I wanted to support you. Because I believe family meant showing up for each other even when it's hard. Her face went white. What? $300 a month. I've been transferring it to help with Miguel's therapy costs. I heard you talking to Mom about having to cut back on his sessions, and I couldn't stand the thought of him losing that support. Talia stared at me, her composure cracking for the first time since she'd arrived. You've been helping with Miguel's therapy? For 8 months. I figured if I couldn't be the sister you wanted in other ways, at least I could help with something that mattered. She buried her face in her hands, and for a moment she looked like the little girl I used to comfort after nightmares, before success and respectability had hardened her into someone I barely recognized. I didn't know, she whispered. Of course, you didn't know. You were too busy discussing whether I was worthy of being in your family photos to notice that I was actually supporting your family in ways that mattered. We sat in silence for several minutes, the weight of this revelation settling between us. I could see her processing the implications, that while she had been working to exclude me from the family narrative, I had been quietly supporting her family in ways she hadn't even realized. I don't know how to fix this, she said finally. Maybe it can't be fixed, I replied. Maybe this is just who we are now. A family that excludes one of its own members to maintain the illusion of perfection. Talia looked up at me, her eyes red with unshed tears. It doesn't have to be this way, doesn't it? Because looking at these photos, it seems like it's been this way for a long time. How many family gatherings have I been erased from? How many times have you all gotten together for photos while I was literally in the next room? She didn't answer, which was answer enough. I stood up and walked to my window, looking down at the street where delivery trucks were navigating the morning rush. You know what the worst part is? It's not even the exclusion itself. It's the way you all convinced yourselves it was normal, that it was somehow kind to me, like I wouldn't notice, like I wouldn't care. Like being erased was actually a favor. Noelle, I'm filming Thanksgiving, I said, turning back to face her. I'm going to document the whole thing, the dinner, the family time, and, most importantly, the moment when you all disappear to take your annual family portraits without me. Talia's expression shifted from guilt to alarm. You can't do that. You can't film us without our permission. I can film my own experience of being excluded from my own family. I can document what it feels like to be erased by people who claim to love me. That will destroy everything. It will tear the family apart. The family is already torn apart, I said quietly. I'm just planning to document it instead of pretending everything is fine. She stood up, gathering her composure like armor. If you do this, if you make this public, there won't be any way back. You'll be choosing to burn bridges that can't be rebuilt. I'm not burning bridges. I'm documenting the bridges that you all already burned. I'm just making sure there's a record of what happened. Talia walked to the door, then turned back to look at me one more time. I'm sorry, she said. I'm sorry about the photos, about the exclusion, about all of it. But I can't choose you over my family's stability. I can't risk everything we've built. I am your family, I repeated, but she was already gone, leaving me alone with the evidence of my erasure spread across my kitchen table. I picked up the formal family portrait again, studying the faces of people who had raised me, who had shared holidays and birthdays and ordinary Tuesday dinners with me, who had somehow decided that I wasn't worth including in their permanent memories. But looking at the photo now, I realized something I hadn't seen before. They looked happy, yes, but they also looked incomplete. Not because I was missing, but because the effort to exclude me had cost them something too. They had sacrificed authenticity for appearance, connection for control. I opened my laptop and imported the photos into my editing software, adding them to the folder labeled Invisible. These weren't just evidence of my exclusion. They were the missing piece of the story I was trying to tell, the visual proof of how families maintain their cohesion by defining who doesn't belong. The twist wasn't just that I had been excluded from last year's photos. The twist was that everyone had been comfortable with that exclusion, that it had felt natural and right to them. The twist was that I had been invisible to my own family long before they had consciously decided to erase me. The night before Thanksgiving, I stood in my apartment surrounded by cameras, cables, and the mounting anxiety of someone about to cross a line they couldn't uncross. My small space had been transformed into a makeshift production studio, with equipment spread across every surface like the tools of some elaborate heist. 3 cameras sat on my kitchen counter, the discreet handheld Sony that I could operate. With one hand, the medium-format Canon with the telephoto lens for capturing distant shots, and my grandfather's vintage 16mm Bolex that I had inherited but never used. Each camera represented a different approach to documenting the following day: subtle observation, detailed documentation, and something approaching art. I had spent the afternoon testing angles and lighting, mapping out the geography of my parents' house in Queens, planning how to position myself to capture both the family interactions and my own exclusion from them. It felt strange to apply the same methodical preparation I used for my immigration documentaries to my own family trauma, but the ritual of technical planning was keeping my anxiety at manageable levels. The tres leches cake sat in my refrigerator, cooling overnight, according to my grandmother's precise instructions. I had followed her recipe exactly, right down to the proportions of evaporated milk, condensed milk, and heavy cream that would soak into the sponge cake while we slept. Making the cake had been both therapeutic and heartbreaking. Every step connected me to my grandmother's memory, while reminding me that she was the last family member who had never questioned my right to belong. My phone had been buzzing all evening with texts from family members, each message adding another layer of tension to tomorrow's gathering. My mother had sent detailed instructions about arrival time and parking. My father had forwarded a photo of the dining room table, already set with the good china. Miguel had sent a video of himself practicing saying Tia Noelle with perfect pronunciation, his face bright with excitement about seeing me. But it was the silence from Talia that spoke loudest. No follow-up to our confrontation that morning, no attempt to negotiate or compromise, no acknowledgement of the bomb I was about to detonate in the middle of our family tradition. Her silence felt like acceptance, not of my right to document the gathering, but of the inevitable destruction that would follow. I called Jasmine around 10 o'clock, needing to hear a friendly voice before committing to this course of action. "How? Are you holding up?" she asked, and I could hear the concern in her voice even through the phone. I keep oscillating between feeling completely justified and feeling like a terrible person, I admitted, sinking into my desk chair. Like, they've been systematically excluding me for years, so documenting it seems reasonable. But also, I'm about to turn a family dinner into a public spectacle, which feels cruel. Are you having second thoughts? I considered this question. Seriously. Was I having second thoughts? Or was I just scared of the consequences of finally standing up for myself? I don't think I can not do this, I said finally. I think if I go tomorrow and pretend everything is normal, if I smile and eat dinner and act grateful while they exclude me from the photos again, I'll lose something essential about myself. I'll become complicit in my own erasure. Jasmine was quiet for a moment, processing this. Then you have your answer. The question isn't whether this is the right thing to do. The question is whether you can live with not doing it. She was right, of course. This wasn't really about the documentary anymore, or even about the family photos. This was about refusing to disappear quietly, about insisting on being seen, even when being seen made everyone else uncomfortable. After we hung up, I returned to my equipment preparation, checking battery levels and memory card capacity with the obsessive attention to detail that anxiety often produced in me. I had learned from my immigration work that the most important moments often happened when you least expected them, so over-preparation was essential. I was adjusting the settings on the handheld camera when my laptop chimed with an email notification. The sender was an address I didn't recognize, but the subject line made my stomach drop. Tomorrow's documentation. The email was from my mother, sent from an account I had never seen before. Noelle, Talia told me about your plan to film. Tomorrow. I'm writing from this email because I don't want your father to see this message on my regular account. I'm asking you, as your mother, not to do this thing you're planning. This family has weathered many storms by keeping private matters private. Tomorrow is about gratitude and togetherness, not about airing grievances. If you bring cameras to our home, you will be choosing publicity over family. Please reconsider. Mommy. The formal tone of the email, so different from her usual casual texts, made clear how seriously she was taking this threat. But it was the signature that cut deepest. Mommy, the name she had used when I was small, when she would comfort me after nightmares or celebrate my small victories. She was appealing to our most intimate connection while simultaneously defending her decision to exclude me from the family narrative. I started to type several responses, but each attempt felt either too conciliatory or too combative. How do you explain to your mother that documenting your own erasure isn't about airing grievances, but about refusing to be erased? How do you make someone understand that their idea of family togetherness requires your systematic exclusion? Instead of responding immediately, I walked to my window and looked out at the city, where thousands of other families were probably preparing for their own Thanksgiving gatherings. Some of those families were probably struggling with their own dynamics of inclusion and exclusion, their own negotiations between public image and private reality. The thought was oddly comforting. I wasn't the only person facing family contradictions, even if mine felt uniquely painful. I thought about Sophia, preparing for her citizenship test while knowing that legal status wouldn't protect her from being seen as perpetually foreign. I thought about Mr. Patel, caught between his son's criticism that he was too American and his neighbor's assumption that he was too Indian. I thought about all the people I had interviewed who lived in the space between belonging and displacement, who had learned to create their own sense of home, when the institutions around them refused to offer unconditional acceptance. Maybe that was what tomorrow was really about. Not punishing my family or exposing their flaws, but documenting my own journey from seeking their approval to creating my own sense of belonging. Maybe the documentary wasn't about them at all, but about me learning to see myself as worthy of being seen. I finally responded to my mother's email with a single paragraph. Mommy, I understand your concerns about privacy and family unity, but I need you to understand that this documentation isn't about punishment or publicity. It's about visibility. For years, I have been present at family gatherings while being absent from family memories. Tomorrow, I want to document what that experience feels like, not to hurt anyone, but to understand it. I will be respectful, but I will not be invisible. Noelle. After sending the email, I felt a strange calm settle over me. The decision was made, the consequences were acknowledged, and now all that remained was following through. I spent the next hour creating a shot list, mapping out the key moments I wanted to capture. My arrival at the house, the family interactions during dinner, the moment when everyone would excuse themselves for photos, my experience of being left behind. I wasn't planning to film anything secretively, or to catch anyone in embarrassing moments. This would be observational, anthropological, a careful study of how exclusion operated within the structure of family celebration. The technical preparation was almost complete when I realized I was missing something crucial. I hadn't prepared, emotionally, for the possibility that this would work, that documenting my exclusion might actually create change rather than just recording damage. What if my family, confronted with the reality of their behavior being observed and documented, decided to include me in the photos? What if the act of bearing witness forced them to examine their assumptions about family and belonging? I wasn't sure I was ready for that possibility. It felt easier, somehow, to prepare for continued exclusion than to prepare for the possibility of acceptance that came only after I had insisted on being seen. Would inclusion that resulted from pressure and documentation feel like real belonging, or would it just be another performance? These questions followed me as I finally began cleaning up the equipment and preparing for bed. Tomorrow would bring answers, but tonight was for sitting with uncertainty, for accepting that some actions were necessary even when their outcomes were unpredictable. I set out my clothes for the next day. Nothing too formal, nothing that would read as confrontational, just the kind of outfit that would let me blend into the background while operating cameras. I wanted to be visible through my documentation, rather than through my appearance. Before going to bed, I took one last look at the family portraits from 2023, still spread across my kitchen table. Tomorrow's photos would either look exactly like these, complete family happiness without me, or they would look different, because everyone would know they were being observed. Either outcome would tell an important story about how families construct their narratives and who gets included in those constructions. I carefully packed the portraits back in their envelope, adding them to the bag of equipment I would bring tomorrow. They would serve as context, as evidence of the pattern I was documenting, as proof that this wasn't about one bad Thanksgiving, but about years of systematic exclusion that had become so normalized that no one questioned it anymore. As I finally turned off the lights and headed to bed, I felt something I hadn't expected: gratitude. Not for my family's behavior, but for my own courage in refusing to accept it. Tomorrow would be difficult, potentially painful, certainly complicated, but it would also be honest in a way that my family gatherings hadn't been for years. I was finally going to stop pretending that being excluded was normal, that being erased was acceptable, that love could coexist with systematic invisibility. I was going to document my own story, and in doing so, I was going to insist on my right to exist within it. The last thing I did before sleep was check the battery levels on all 3 cameras one more time, ensuring they would be ready to capture whatever tomorrow would bring. Whether it was another chapter in my family's exclusion of me, or the beginning of a different kind of story entirely, it would be recorded, preserved, and understood. For the first time in weeks, I felt ready. But as I lay in bed, staring at the ceiling in the darkness, my mind kept returning to Miguel's video message. His little face had been so bright with excitement about seeing his tia Noelle, about showing me how well he could pronounce my name now thanks to the speech therapy I had been secretly funding. He had no idea that his family had been systematically excluding me from their official memories, that tomorrow's gathering would be another performance of inclusion that masked deliberate erasure. What would this do to him? When the adults disappeared for photos and I remained behind, would he ask why tia Noelle wasn't in the pictures? Would they have to explain to a 5-year-old why some family members were worthy of being remembered and others weren't? Or would they simply redirect his attention, teach him not to ask questions about who was missing from the frame? I thought about the cycles of family dynamics, how patterns of exclusion and inclusion get passed down through generations like inherited traits. My parents had learned their ideas about respectability and family image from their own upbringing, from the struggles of being immigrants who had to prove their worth in a society that questioned their belonging. In some ways, their exclusion of me was just another manifestation of the same fear that had shaped their entire American experience. The terror of not being acceptable enough, not successful enough, not normal enough to deserve a place at the table. But understanding the origins of their behavior didn't make it hurt less. And it certainly didn't make it acceptable to perpetuate those patterns onto the next generation, to teach Miguel that love was conditional on conformity, that family meant erasing the parts of yourself that didn't fit the approved narrative. Pulled out my phone and looked at his video message one more time, watching his careful pronunciation of my name, his proud smile when he got it right. Tomorrow, I would be documenting my exclusion partly for him, partly to create a record that would prevent this pattern from continuing unchanged into his generation. Maybe someday, when he was old enough to understand, he would see this documentary and realize that family could be different, that love didn't have to require disappearance. I arrived at my parents' house in Queens at exactly 1:47 p.m., 13 minutes before the photographer was scheduled to arrive for the family portraits. I wouldn't be included in. The timing was deliberate. I wanted to document the entire choreography of my exclusion, from the moment I walked through the door to the moment everyone else disappeared to create memories without me. The Sony camera hung from my shoulder, small, enough to be unobtrusive, but visible enough to make my intentions clear. The Canon remained in my bag, along with the vintage Bolex and the envelope containing last year's family portraits. I had chosen to carry the tres leches cake in a glass dish that required both hands, forcing anyone who wanted to question my filming equipment to wait until I had set down my grandmother's contribution to the meal. My father opened the door before I could knock, his face cycling through surprise, confusion, and resignation as he took in my appearance. The camera didn't seem to register with him immediately. He was focused on the cake dish, on the familiar ritual of welcoming me with complaints about how I shouldn't have gone to so much trouble. "Noelle, mija, you know you didn't need to bring anything," he said, reaching for the cake dish. "Your mother has been cooking since yesterday. It's Grandma Lourdes' tres leches," I said, stepping into the familiar warmth of my childhood home. I wanted to bring something she would have made. The mention of my grandmother softened his expression, and for a moment, I saw the father who had taught me to ride a bike, who had stayed up late helping me with school projects, who had quietly slipped me $20 when my mother wasn't looking. But then his eyes found the camera on my shoulder, and the softness vanished. "Noelle, what is that?" "It's a camera, Poppy. I'm documenting today." Before he could respond, my mother emerged from the kitchen, wiping her hands on the apron that had belonged to her own mother. She took in the scene at the front door, me with my camera, my father with the cake dish, the moment frozen between welcome and confrontation. "I got your email," she said quietly. "Then you know why I'm here." The living room felt smaller than I remembered, crowded with the extended family that gathered every year for this performance of togetherness. My Uncle Roberto was adjusting the volume on the television where the Macy's parade played to an audience of no one. My Aunt Carmen was arguing with my cousin Maria about whether the stuffing needed more salt. Miguel was sprawled on the carpet, building something elaborate with Legos, while his grandfather offered unhelpful suggestions. Normal. Everything looked completely normal, except for the camera that hung from my shoulder like a question mark, punctuating the familiar scene. Talia appeared in the doorway between the living room and kitchen, and our eyes met across the room. She looked tired, older than she had just 2 days earlier, when she had sat in my apartment surrounded by evidence of my exclusion. Behind her, I could see Liam setting out wine glasses, his movements careful and deliberate, as if he were walking through a minefield. "Tia Noelle!" Miguel launched himself off the floor and across the room, wrapping his arms around my legs with the uncomplicated enthusiasm of a 5-year-old who had missed his aunt. "Look, I can say your name perfect now. Tia Noelle, Tia Noelle, Tia Noelle." I knelt down to his level, the camera swinging awkwardly as I hugged him back. "You sound amazing, mijo. Dr. Martinez is helping you so much." Over his head, I caught Talia's sharp intake of breath. She had forgotten, in the drama of the last few days, that Miguel's progress was partially funded by the aunt they were planning to exclude from the family photos. I stood and raised the camera, framing the living room scene. Through the viewfinder, I could see my family as if for the first time, not as the people who had shaped my childhood, but as subjects in a story about belonging and exclusion. My Uncle Roberto, frozen mid-gesture as he realized he was being filmed. My Aunt Carmen, her mouth slightly open as she processed what my presence with a camera meant. My parents, standing together but apart, united in their discomfort with being observed. "Noelle," my mother said, her voice carrying the authority she had wielded when I was 12 and refusing to wear a dress to church. "Turn off the camera." I lowered the camera but didn't turn it off. "I'm documenting my experience of this family gathering. I'm not filming anyone without their knowledge, and I'm not trying to embarrass anyone. I'm just recording what happens." "What happens is a private family dinner," Talia said, moving closer to where I stood. This isn't a documentary subject. This is our family. It's my family, too, I replied, raising the camera again. And my experience of this family is part of the story I'm telling. The next hour unfolded like a surreal performance, with everyone hyper-aware of being observed but trying to maintain the pretense of normalcy. Conversations that would usually flow naturally became stilted and self-conscious. My uncle Roberto, who typically told inappropriate jokes during dinner, sat mostly silent. My Aunt Carmen, who usually gossiped about neighbors and distant relatives, spoke only about safe topics like the weather and Miguel's school performance. But the most revealing moments were the ones that happened around the edges of the performance. My father, sliding an extra serving of pernil onto my plate when he thought no one was looking. My mother, flinching every time the camera turned in her direction, but unable to stop herself from checking that I had enough to eat. Liam, making quiet conversation with me about my documentary work while the others pretended not to listen. And Miguel, blissfully unaware of the undercurrents, chattering about his Legos, his friends at school, his excitement about the picture day that would happen after dinner. It was Miguel's mention of pictures that shifted the energy in the room. Suddenly, everyone was checking the time, glancing toward the front door, making subtle preparations for the photographer's arrival. My mother disappeared into the kitchen and returned with her lipstick, touching up her makeup. Talia smoothed Miguel's hair and adjusted his collar. My father straightened the pillows on the couch that would serve as the backdrop for the formal family portraits. I continued filming, documenting the choreography of preparation for an event I would not be part of. At exactly 2 p.m., the doorbell rang. Through my camera's viewfinder, I watched my family transform from a group of individuals eating dinner into a coordinated unit, preparing to document their togetherness. Everyone stood a little straighter, smiled a little brighter, gathered closer, together, as if pulled by invisible strings toward the performance of family unity. The photographer was a middle-aged man with expensive equipment and the practiced efficiency of someone who documented other people's important moments for a living. He set up his lights and backdrops while my family arranged themselves according to some predetermined hierarchy I had never been included in understanding. All right, let's start with the full family portrait, the photographer said, gesturing, for everyone to gather in front of the fireplace. This was the moment I had been preparing for, the climax of my documentation project. I raised my camera and began filming as my family arranged themselves for a photograph that would not include me. My parents took the center positions, my mother's hand resting on my father's arm. Talia and Liam flanked them, with Miguel positioned in front of the group. My uncle Roberto and Aunt Carmen stood slightly to the side, completing the composition of people who belonged in the permanent record of this family gathering. And I stood behind my own camera, documenting my exclusion from behind the lens that had become both my protection and my weapon. Perfect, the photographer said, checking his settings. Everyone look this way and think happy thoughts. Happy thoughts. I almost laughed at the absurdity of it. What happy thoughts were they thinking as they deliberately constructed a family portrait that erased one of their own members? What joy were they feeling as they created memories that would reinforce my invisibility for generations to come? But as I watched them through my viewfinder, I realized something unexpected. They didn't look happy. They looked tense, self-conscious, performative. My mother's smile was too bright, too forced. My father kept glancing in my direction, his expression troubled. Even Miguel seemed to sense that something was wrong, his usual exuberance dimmed by the strange energy in the room. Wait, Miguel said suddenly, just as the photographer was about to take the first shot. Where's Tia Noelle? The room went silent. The photographer lowered his camera, confused by the interruption. My family froze in their carefully arranged positions, faced with the question they had been hoping to avoid. Tia Noelle doesn't want to be in the pictures, mijo, Talia said quickly, her voice strained with the effort of making this lie sound natural. But Miguel was 5 years old, and 5-year-olds have not yet learned to accept explanations that don't make sense. He turned to look at me, standing behind my camera, clearly not excluded by my own choice. But she's right there, he said, pointing at me with the devastating logic of childhood. Why isn't she in the family picture? I continued filming as my family struggled to answer this question. The silence stretched on, filled with the weight of years of normalized exclusion, suddenly exposed as unnatural, unkind, incomprehensible to someone who hadn't yet learned that families could choose to forget their own members. The pictures are just for the immediate family, my mother said finally. But even she seemed to realize how hollow this sounded when she was including my Uncle Roberto and Aunt Carmen, who were less immediately related to her than her own daughter. But Tia Noelle is immediate family, Miguel said, his confusion genuine and heartbreaking. She's my tia. She helps me with my talking. The last sentence hung in the air like an accusation. Miguel had unknowingly revealed what the adults in the room had worked so hard to ignore, that I was not just present, but contributing, not just related but caring, not just family but family who showed up in ways that mattered. I lowered my camera for the first time since the portraits had begun, and in that moment, something shifted in the room. Without the lens between us, I was no longer the documentarian observing the scene. I was just Noelle, standing in my family's living room, excluded from their creation of memories, while my 5-year-old nephew asked the questions the adults were afraid to answer. You know what, Miguel? I said, my voice steadier than I felt. You're absolutely right. I am immediate family. And I have been helping you with your talking, sending money for your speech therapy every month because I wanted to support you and your parents. Talia's face went white. Liam reached for her hand. My parents stared at me with expressions I couldn't read. But your family has decided that I don't belong in their pictures, I continued, raising my camera again. So I'm making my own pictures, telling my own story about what it feels like to be erased by people who claim to love you. I filmed Miguel's face as he processed this information, his child's mind trying to make sense of the adult dynamics that had shaped his world in ways he was only beginning to understand. I filmed my parents as they realized that their careful choreography of exclusion had been witnessed and questioned by the person they loved most in the room. I filmed the photographer, standing awkwardly with his expensive equipment, suddenly understanding that he had been hired not just to document a family, but to participate in someone's erasure. And then I turned the camera on myself, documenting my own face as I spoke directly into the lens. My name is Noelle Rivera. I am 26 years old, and this is my family. For years, they have been creating memories without me, taking photographs that erase my existence while I stand in the same room. Today, I am documenting that erasure. I am making myself visible in the only way I know how, by refusing to disappear quietly, by insisting on being seen, by creating my own record of what it means to belong to people who wish you didn't. I turned off the camera. The room was completely silent except for the distant sound of the television in the background and Miguel's quiet sniffling as he began to cry, overwhelmed by emotions he was too young to name but old enough to feel. That was when I knew the documentary was complete. Not because I had captured everything I had planned to capture, but because I had documented the moment when the system of exclusion finally collapsed under the weight of its own contradiction. When a child's honest question had exposed the cruelty that adults had dressed up as family tradition. I packed up my equipment as my family stood frozen in their portrait formation, no longer sure how to proceed with their choreographed celebration. The photographer, sensing the shift in the room, began quietly packing up his own equipment. As I headed toward the door, carrying my grandmother's empty cake dish and my bag of cameras, my father called my name. Noelle. I turned back to look at him, this man who had raised me, who had worked double shifts to give me opportunities, who had somehow become complicit in my erasure despite loving me. I'm sorry, he said simply. It wasn't enough to fix everything, but it was the first honest thing anyone had said in that room all day. I nodded and walked out of my childhood home, carrying with me the footage that would become the most important story I would ever tell. 3 months later, I sat in the community center where Mrs. Rodriguez had first named my experience as family exile, watching 50 strangers react to the most personal story I had ever told. The documentary, titled Invisible, was being screened as part of a series on contemporary family dynamics, and the audience was transfixed. When Miguel's voice filled the room, asking, "Where's Tia Noelle?" several people gasped. When my father's quiet, "I'm sorry," played over the final credits, the silence was complete. During the Q&A, a woman in her 60s asked, "What happened next? Did your family change?" I had been asked this at every screening. "Some things changed," I said. "My father calls me every Sunday now. My mother sent me all of my grandmother's recipe cards with a note saying I should have them. Miguel asks for me specifically when they're planning family photos." "And your sister?" "Talia and I are still figuring it out." She apologized eventually. She also stopped making Miguel's therapy payments, saying it should come from me since I'd been handling it anyway. "We're learning honesty instead of pretending. Everything is fine." After the screening, Jasmine and I walked to our usual diner. She studied my face across the table, reading something in my expression. "You look different," she said. "How?" "Settled, like you've stopped looking for approval from people who were never going to give it." She was right. The documentary had freed me from the exhausting work of trying to earn my place in a family that had already decided I didn't fit. Not because they were evil people, but because they were scared people who had confused conformity with love, image with belonging. I showed Jasmine a photo from our chosen family Thanksgiving the week before. It was deliberately imperfect. Jasmine laughing with her mouth full, Mrs. Rodriguez gesturing wildly as she told a story, Sophia and Mr. Patel from my immigration documentary arguing good-naturedly about politics, and me in the center, visible and valued not despite my differences but because of them. "This is my real family photo," I said. The documentary continued screening at festivals and community centers, sparking conversations about belonging and visibility. I received messages from people who recognized their own stories: queer kids, excluded from Christmas cards, unconventional siblings cropped out of wedding photos, dreamers made invisible by families who equated safety with sameness. 6 months after that Thanksgiving, I received an unexpected package. Inside was a professional family portrait, not the formal version, but a candid shot the photographer had taken of everyone laughing at something Miguel had said. There, in the corner, was me with my camera, documenting the moment while being part of it. A note was tucked beneath in my mother's handwriting. "For your wall, mija. So you remember that you were always there, even when we couldn't see you clearly." I hung the photo next to my grandmother's recipe box, 2 artifacts that told the story of belonging I had been trying to understand my entire life. Some families are born, some families are chosen. The lucky ones learn that the best families are both. My name is Noelle Rivera. I am 26 years old, and I am finally completely visible. Up next, we have 2 more incredible stories that are waiting for you. Just click the image you want to watch and it will take you there. If you enjoyed this video, make sure to subscribe. It would mean a lot.